The morning sun cast long shadows across the military compound as Captain Sarah Mitchell adjusted her uniform for the 100th time. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear of the upcoming ceremony, but from the weight of what she knew she had to do. Today was supposed to be a celebration of military excellence, a display of honor and tradition before 400 of the nation's finest soldiers. Instead, it would become the day that changed everything. General Marcus Thornfield stood at the podium, his chest decorated with ribbons and medals that told the story of a distinguished career spanning 3 decades. To the outside world, he was the epitome of military leadership, commanding, respected, and seemingly untouchable. But Sarah knew the truth that lay beneath that polished exterior, a truth that had been eating away at her conscience for months. The assault had happened 6 weeks earlier, in the general's private office after a late evening briefing. Sarah had been called in to discuss the details of an upcoming operation when Thornfield made his move. The memory still burned fresh in her mind, his hands where they didn't belong, his threats when she resisted, and the sickening realization that this wasn't the first time he had abused his position of power. In the weeks that followed, Sarah discovered she wasn't alone. Whispered conversations in the mess hall revealed a pattern of behavior that stretched back years. Lieutenant Amanda Rodriguez had confided about inappropriate comments during performance reviews. Sergeant Kelly Thompson spoke of unwanted advances during training exercises. The stories were always similar: a powerful man using his rank to prey on those who couldn't fight back without destroying their careers. The military's traditional chain of command had failed them. When Sarah attempted to file a formal complaint, she found herself facing a wall of bureaucracy and implicit threats. The investigating officer, a close friend of Thornfield's, suggested that perhaps she had misinterpreted the general's actions. The message was clear: challenging someone of Thornfield's stature would be career suicide. But Sarah Mitchell was not someone who backed down from a fight. Growing up in a working-class family in Detroit, she had learned early that sometimes you had to stand up to bullies, regardless of the consequences. Her father, a factory worker who had spent years fighting for better conditions for his fellow employees, had taught her that doing the right thing was more important than doing the safe thing. The idea came to her during a conversation with her younger brother Marcus, who was studying journalism at Northwestern University. He had been investigating cases of institutional cover-ups and suggested that sometimes public exposure was the only way to force accountability. The upcoming ceremony would be broadcast live on military television networks and attended by media representatives from major news outlets. Sarah began her preparation methodically, gathering evidence and building her case like the trained intelligence officer she was. She documented every incident she could verify, collected statements from other victims, and researched the legal precedents for her planned action. She knew that what she was about to do would likely end her military career, but she also knew that staying silent would mean more women would suffer. The night before the ceremony, Sarah sat in her small apartment off base, staring at the letter she had written to her parents. She tried to explain her decision, knowing they would worry about her future but hoping they would understand her choice. Her mother had always told her that a person's character was defined not by what they did when people were watching, but by what they did when they thought no one would ever know. As she walked onto the parade ground that morning, Sarah could feel the eyes of 400 soldiers following her movements. She had been selected to present the battalion's achievements to the general, an honor that should have been the highlight of her career. Instead, it would serve as the platform for the most important moment of her life. General Thornfield's speech droned on about duty, honor, and the sacred trust between soldiers. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah as she listened to him lecture about values he had repeatedly violated. She watched the faces of the soldiers in the crowd, many of them young women who looked up to leaders like Thornfield, unaware of the predator hiding behind the uniform. The moment approached as the general called for the presentation of achievements. Sarah stepped forward, her heart pounding but her resolve unwavering. She carried with her not just the official report she was supposed to deliver, but copies of documentation that would expose the truth about the man standing before her. As she reached the podium, Thornfield smiled at her with the same predatory expression she remembered from that night in his office. He had no idea that his carefully constructed facade was about to crumble before hundreds of witnesses. In his arrogance, he had underestimated the strength and determination of the woman he had tried to silence. The crowd fell silent as Sarah began to speak. Her voice was steady and clear as she deviated from the prepared script. and began to tell the real story of leadership in their unit. She spoke of the brave men and women who served with honor, and then she spoke of those who had betrayed that trust. General Thornfield's face changed as he realized what was happening. The color drained from his cheeks as Sarah detailed his pattern of sexual assault and harassment. He reached toward her, perhaps to silence her or grab the microphone, but Sarah was ready for him. The physical confrontation that followed happened so quickly that many in the crowd weren't sure what they had witnessed. Thornfield's hand struck Sarah's face in front of 400 soldiers and television cameras. A moment of violence that would be replayed on news networks around the world. But Sarah had trained in hand-to-hand combat since joining the military, and her reflexes were sharp. Her counterstrike was swift and precise, a perfectly executed defensive move that sent the general stumbling backward. But it was what happened next that truly shocked everyone present. As Thornfield tried to regain his balance, his foot caught the edge of the podium step, and he fell heavily to the ground, his head striking the concrete with a sickening sound. The silence that followed was deafening. 400 soldiers stared in disbelief as their commanding general lay motionless on the ground, brought down not by enemy fire or battlefield heroics, but by his own arrogance and a young captain's refusal to remain silent. Emergency medical personnel rushed to the scene as Sarah stood over the fallen general, still clutching the evidence that would destroy his career and reputation. She knew that everything had changed in that moment. The carefully ordered world of military hierarchy had been shattered, and there would be no going back. As the medics worked to revive General Thornfield, Sarah felt a mixture of emotions she couldn't quite sort through. Relief that the truth was finally out, fear about what would happen to her next, and a grim satisfaction that justice had finally been served, even if not in the way she had planned. The crowd of soldiers began to murmur as word spread about what Sarah had revealed. Some looked shocked, others nodded with understanding, recognizing the truth in her words. The younger female soldiers in particular seemed to view her with a mixture of admiration and concern, understanding the courage it had taken to speak out against such a powerful figure. Television cameras captured every moment of the chaos that followed. News crews that had come to film a routine military ceremony instead found themselves documenting one of the most dramatic exposures of military corruption in recent memory. Within hours, the footage would be broadcast around the world, sparking conversations about abuse of power, military justice, and the courage of those who speak truth to authority. Military police arrived on the scene, but they faced an unusual situation. The person who had physically struck a superior officer was also the victim of that officer's crimes, and her actions had been broadcast live to a national audience. The traditional military justice system wasn't equipped to handle such a complex situation. As General Thornfield was loaded into an ambulance, still unconscious from his fall, Sarah was escorted away by military police. But she walked with her head held high, knowing that she had done what needed to be done. The evidence she had gathered would be examined by investigators. The other victims would finally have their voices heard, and the culture of silence that had protected predators like Thornfield would begin to crumble. The aftermath of those few minutes would reverberate through the military establishment for months to come. But in that moment, as Sarah was led away from the parade ground, she felt something she hadn't experienced in weeks: peace. The burden of carrying Thornfield's secrets had been lifted from her shoulders, and regardless of what happened next, she knew she had made the right choice. The story of Captain Sarah Mitchell's confrontation with General Thornfield was just beginning, but already it was clear that this would be remembered as a turning point in the ongoing fight against sexual assault and abuse of power in the military. Her courage in speaking out would inspire others to come forward, and the general's dramatic downfall would serve as a warning to those who believed their rank made them untouchable. As the crowd of soldiers slowly dispersed, many of them were already discussing what they had witnessed. Some questioned whether Sarah had gone too far, while others praised her bravery. But one thing was certain: the events of that morning had changed everything, and there would be no going back to the way things were before. The investigation that would follow would uncover a network of abuse and cover-up that reached far beyond General Thornfield. Sarah's act of defiance had lit a fuse that would expose corruption throughout the command structure, leading to reforms that would make the military safer for future generations of service members. But that was still to come. For now, Sarah Mitchell sat in a holding cell, waiting to learn her fate, but secure in the knowledge that she had stood up for what was right when it mattered most. The general who had seemed so powerful and untouchable just hours before lay in a hospital bed, his career and reputation in ruins, brought low by the courage of a woman he had tried to silence. The hospital room was quiet, except for the steady beeping of monitors that tracked General Marcus Thornfield's vital signs. He had been unconscious for 18 hours since his dramatic fall at the ceremony, and the medical team remained cautiously optimistic about his recovery. But the man who would eventually wake up would face a world vastly different from the one he had controlled just a day earlier. News of the incident had spread like wildfire through social media and traditional news outlets. The footage of Captain Sarah Mitchell's accusations, followed by the general's violent reaction and subsequent collapse, had been viewed millions of times across various platforms. Hashtags like #MilitaryMeToo and #JusticeForSarah began trending as people around the world weighed in on the dramatic confrontation. In the Pentagon, emergency meetings were being held at the highest levels of command. Secretary of Defense Patricia Williams found herself dealing with the biggest military scandal in a generation. The live television broadcast had made it impossible to control the narrative or manage the crisis behind closed doors. The entire military establishment was under scrutiny, and tough questions were being asked about how such behavior could persist unchecked for so long. Captain Mitchell remained in military detention, but her situation was complicated by the public attention her case had received. Military lawyers worked around the clock to determine the appropriate charges and procedures. The traditional approach would be to court-martial her for striking a superior officer, but the circumstances made this a legal and public relations nightmare. Her civilian attorney, Rebecca Chen, arrived at the base within hours of the incident. Chen was a former military lawyer who had built a reputation defending service members in high-profile cases. She understood the complexities of military justice and the unique challenges faced by those who challenged the system from within. "Sarah, what you did yesterday took incredible courage," Chen told her during their first meeting in the detention facility. "But we need to be prepared for the fight ahead. The military establishment doesn't change easily, and there will be powerful people who want to make an example of you." Sarah sat across from her attorney, still processing the events of the previous day. The adrenaline had worn off, replaced by the reality of her situation. "I knew this would happen when I decided to speak out, but I couldn't live with myself if I stayed silent and more women were hurt." The investigation into Thornfield's conduct began immediately, led by Colonel James Patterson, a respected officer known for his integrity and thoroughness. Patterson had been specifically chosen for his independence from Thornfield's network of allies and his reputation for following evidence wherever it led, regardless of political consequences. Within the first 24 hours of the investigation, 3 more women came forward with allegations against the general. Lieutenant Amanda Rodriguez, whose earlier conversation with Sarah had helped confirm the pattern of abuse, formally filed a complaint detailing inappropriate conduct during a performance review 6 months earlier. Her account included text messages from Thornfield that suggested retaliation when she rebuffed his advances. Sergeant Kelly Thompson provided a detailed statement about an incident during a training exercise where Thornfield had cornered her in a supply tent and made unwanted physical contact. She had reported the incident to her immediate supervisor, but the complaint had mysteriously disappeared from the official record. Thompson had kept her own detailed notes and photographs of injuries sustained during the assault. The third woman to come forward was Major Lisa Chen, a decorated officer who had served under Thornfield 3 years earlier at a different base. Her story was particularly damaging because it showed the pattern of behavior had continued across multiple assignments and had escalated over time. Major Chen described being assaulted in Thornfield's quarters after being ordered to attend a private briefing that never actually occurred. As the investigation expanded, Colonel Patterson's team discovered a systematic pattern of cover-up and intimidation. Several officers who had received complaints about Thornfield's behavior were interviewed, revealing a culture of silence enforced through career threats and transfers. Junior officers who had tried to report incidents found themselves assigned to remote or undesirable postings, while those who stayed quiet received promotions and favorable assignments. The media attention intensified as investigative journalists began digging deeper into Thornfield's background and the military's response to previous allegations. Reporter Michael Harrison from the Washington Herald obtained documents through Freedom of Information Act requests that showed at least 6 formal complaints had been filed against Thornfield over the past 5 years, all of which had been dismissed or buried in bureaucratic procedures. Harrison's reporting revealed that Thornfield had been quietly transferred between assignments whenever allegations became too persistent, a practice known in military circles as passing the trash. Each new assignment came with glowing recommendations that failed to mention any disciplinary issues, allowing him to continue his predatory behavior with fresh victims who had no knowledge of his history. The public response was immediate and overwhelming. Veterans organizations, women's rights groups, and military families demanded accountability not just for Thornfield, but for the entire system that had enabled his behavior. Protests were organized outside military installations across the country, with demonstrators calling for comprehensive reform of how sexual assault cases were handled in the armed forces. Congressional leaders from both parties announced plans for hearings on military sexual assault policies. Senator Maria Rodriguez, the ranking member of the Armed Services Committee, issued a statement calling for a complete overhaul of the military justice system. The courage shown by Captain Mitchell in exposing this predator should not be the exception, Rodriguez declared. We need systematic change that protects victims and holds perpetrators accountable, regardless of their rank. Inside the military hospital, General Thornfield finally regained consciousness on the second day after his collapse. The first thing he saw was his wife, Margaret, sitting beside his bed with tears in her eyes. Margaret had been married to Marcus for 25 years and believed she knew him completely. The revelations of the past 2 days had shattered her understanding of the man she had loved and supported throughout his career. "Marcus, they're saying terrible things about you," Margaret whispered, holding his hand as he struggled to focus. "Please tell me it's not true. Tell me Sarah Mitchell is lying." But Thornfield's silence spoke volumes. As his memory of recent events returned, he realized the magnitude of his situation. The career he had spent decades building was over, and criminal charges were likely. The respect and authority he had wielded were gone, replaced by disgrace and infamy. His military attorney, Colonel David Brooks, arrived shortly after Thornfield regained consciousness. Brooks faced the difficult task of representing a client whose alleged crimes had been broadcast to a global audience and who had physically struck his accuser on live television. "General, I need to be direct with you," Brooks said during their first meeting. "The evidence against you is substantial and growing. Multiple victims have come forward, and there's documentary evidence supporting their claims. We need to discuss your options, including the possibility of a plea agreement." Thornfield's initial response was denial and anger. He blamed Sarah Mitchell for destroying his career and accused the other women of opportunistic lying. But as Brooks detailed the evidence being compiled against him, the general began to understand the hopelessness of his situation. Meanwhile, Captain Mitchell's case was becoming a cause célèbre for military reform advocates. Donations poured into a legal defense fund established by veterans organizations. Military personnel from around the world reached out to express their support, many sharing their own stories of harassment and assault that had gone unreported. The base where the incident occurred became the focus of intense media scrutiny. Reporters interviewed soldiers who had witnessed the confrontation, and their accounts consistently supported Captain Mitchell's version of events. Several soldiers spoke anonymously about the culture of fear that had surrounded General Thornfield and their relief that his behavior had finally been exposed. Colonel Patterson's investigation team worked methodically to build their case, but they faced resistance from some corners of the military establishment. Anonymous attempts were made to discredit the investigation and the victims, including leaked information suggesting that Captain Mitchell had been romantically involved with other officers, implications that she was mentally unstable, and claims that she had fabricated the allegations for personal gain. These smear tactics backfired spectacularly when investigative journalists traced the leaks to officers who were personal friends of General Thornfield. The revelation that the military was attempting to destroy the reputation of a sexual assault victim who had shown extraordinary courage in speaking out only intensified public outrage and calls for reform. Rebecca Chen, Captain Mitchell's attorney, used the media attention strategically to build public support for her client while preparing for the legal battles ahead. She appeared on news programs to explain the complexities of military justice and the challenges faced by service members who report sexual assault. Sarah Mitchell did what the system failed to do, Chen explained during a television interview. She exposed a predator who had been protected by rank and privilege. Now that same system wants to punish her for having the courage to speak the truth. We cannot let that happen. The investigation expanded to include other military installations where Thornfield had served. Similar patterns of behavior emerged at each location, with victims coming forward to share their experiences. The scope of the abuse became clear, as more than a dozen women eventually provided statements to investigators. Some of the most damaging evidence came from Thornfield's own communications. Investigators obtained search warrants for his electronic devices and discovered thousands of inappropriate messages, photos, and videos. The content painted a picture of a man who viewed his position of authority as an opportunity for sexual exploitation and who had no regard for the well-being of those under his command. The legal team representing General Thornfield began exploring plea options as the evidence mounted. The possibility of a court-martial that would air all the details of his crimes in public was becoming increasingly unattractive. A plea agreement might allow him to avoid the most serious charges while accepting responsibility for his actions. But Captain Mitchell and her supporters made it clear they wanted full accountability, not just for Thornfield but for the system that had enabled him. The case had become about more than one general's crimes. It had become a symbol of the need for comprehensive reform of military culture and justice. As the second day after the confrontation ended, both the accused and the accuser faced uncertain futures. General Thornfield lay in his hospital bed, his career destroyed, and his freedom in jeopardy, while Captain Mitchell remained in detention, her courage having sparked a national conversation about justice and accountability in the military. The battle lines were being drawn for what would become one of the most significant military justice cases in modern history, with implications that would extend far beyond the individuals involved. The Pentagon briefing room buzzed with tension as Secretary of Defense Patricia Williams prepared to address the media for the first time since the incident at Fort Morrison. 3 days had passed since Captain Sarah Mitchell's explosive accusations against General Marcus Thornfield, and the pressure for an official response had become overwhelming. Williams knew that her words would be scrutinized by Congress, the military, and a public demanding accountability. "Ladies and gentlemen," Williams began, her voice steady but grave, "the events of Monday morning at Fort Morrison represent a serious breach of the trust placed in our military leadership. I want to be clear that the Department of Defense takes these allegations extremely seriously, and we are committed to a thorough and transparent investigation." The questions came immediately. Reporters pressed for details about what the Pentagon knew about Thornfield's behavior and when they knew it. Williams carefully navigated the inquiries, acknowledging that systemic failures had occurred while avoiding specifics that might compromise the ongoing investigation. But her admission that there had been warning signs that should have been addressed sent shockwaves through the military establishment. Meanwhile, at Fort Morrison, Colonel James Patterson's investigation had uncovered evidence that painted an increasingly damning picture of General Thornfield's conduct. The forensic analysis of his electronic devices revealed a pattern of predatory behavior that stretched back more than a decade. Text messages showed him using his authority to coerce junior officers into sexual encounters, often threatening their careers if they refused. One particularly disturbing discovery was a detailed record Thornfield had kept of his encounters with female subordinates. The files contained photos, personal information, and what appeared to be a rating system he had developed to categorize his targets. The meticulous nature of the record suggested a level of premeditation that transformed isolated incidents of harassment into evidence of a calculated campaign of sexual predation. Captain Mitchell's detention had become a rallying point for military reform advocates. The irony that the victim of sexual assault was being held in custody while her attacker recovered in a comfortable hospital room was not lost on observers. Her attorney, Rebecca Chen, filed multiple motions challenging the detention and demanding that charges against her client be dropped. The legal arguments were complex, centering on the military's duty to protect service members from assault and the right of individuals to defend themselves against illegal attacks. Chen argued that Thornfield's strike against Captain Mitchell constituted assault and that her client's response was lawful self-defense. The fact that the general's subsequent fall was accidental should not, she contended, result in criminal charges against the victim. Support for Captain Mitchell continued to grow within the military itself. A group of female officers circulated a letter defending her actions and calling for charges to be dropped. The letter, which eventually gathered more than 3,000 signatures, described the culture of fear that had allowed predators like Thornfield to operate with impunity. Captain Mitchell did what the system failed to do, the letter stated. She protected herself and gave voice to victims who had been silenced by rank and intimidation. The military's response to her courage will determine whether we are truly committed to creating a safe environment for all service members. The letter's circulation created its own controversy within military ranks. Several high-ranking officers attempted to prevent their subordinates from signing, threatening disciplinary action against those who supported Captain Mitchell. These heavy-handed tactics backfired when they became public, generating additional criticism of military leadership and their handling of the crisis. General Thornfield was released from the hospital after 4 days, having recovered from his concussion with no apparent long-term effects. He was immediately placed under house arrest, pending the outcome of the investigation and formal charges. His once impressive home in the officers' quarters became his prison, surrounded by military police and media vans. His wife, Margaret, found herself thrust into an impossible situation. 25 years of marriage had not prepared her for the revelations about her husband's secret life. The evidence compiled by investigators left no room for doubt about his guilt, forcing her to confront the reality that the man she had loved and supported was a serial predator who had used his authority to victimize vulnerable women. The couple's adult children, both successful professionals in their own right, struggled with the public disgrace their father had brought upon the family. Their son, Michael, attorney in Washington, D.C., issued a statement supporting the victims and distancing himself from his father's actions. Their daughter, Jennifer, a physician, canceled her planned wedding, unable to proceed with celebrations while her father's crimes dominated headlines. As the investigation expanded, it became clear that Thornfield's behavior was part of a broader culture problem within certain segments of the military. Colonel Patterson's team identified several other high-ranking officers who had either participated in the cover-up or had similar allegations against them. The scope of the investigation grew to include multiple bases and thousands of personnel interviews. One of the most significant developments came when Major Elena Rodriguez, Thornfield's former aide-de-camp, provided a detailed account of how the cover-up had operated. Rodriguez described a systematic effort to silence victims, transfer complaining personnel to remote assignments, and destroy evidence of misconduct. Her testimony implicated several senior officers who had actively participated in protecting Thornfield, despite knowing about his crimes. Rodriguez's decision to come forward was particularly courageous given her position. As Thornfield's aide, she had been privy to information that could have destroyed her career if revealed prematurely. But the captain's bold stand had inspired her to risk everything in pursuit of justice. "I watched him destroy careers and ruin lives," Rodriguez told investigators. Women who spoke up were labeled as troublemakers and pushed out of the military. Those who stayed quiet lived in fear. "I should have acted sooner, but Captain Mitchell showed me that doing the right thing is worth any personal cost." The congressional hearings announced in the immediate aftermath of the incident began in earnest. Senator Maria Rodriguez led a bipartisan group of lawmakers in examining the military's handling of sexual assault cases. The hearings were broadcast live, bringing unprecedented public attention to issues that had long been hidden from civilian oversight. Captain Mitchell was called to testify before Congress, her first public appearance since the confrontation. The hearing room was packed with media, military personnel, and advocates. Her appearance in uniform, flanked by her attorney and military escorts, created a powerful visual contrast with the traditional hearing format. Her testimony was measured and detailed, walking through her experiences with Thornfield and her decision to speak out publicly. She described the fear and isolation she had felt, the failed attempts to report through proper channels, and the moment when she realized that dramatic action was necessary to protect others. "I understand that my actions violated military protocol," Captain Mitchell testified. "But when the system fails to protect its own people, individuals must be prepared to take extraordinary action. I would rather face court-martial than allow General Thornfield to continue victimizing women under his command." The impact of her testimony was immediate and profound. Several senators who had been skeptical of military reform efforts publicly changed their positions. The authenticity and courage she displayed contrasted sharply with the evasive responses typically given by military officials when questioned about controversial topics. General Thornfield's attorney attempted to limit the damage to his client by negotiating a plea agreement that would avoid a public court-martial. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and a trial would only provide additional opportunities for victims to share their stories publicly. The military justice system, already under intense scrutiny, had little appetite for a prolonged spectacle that would further damage the institution's reputation. But the victims, led by Captain Mitchell, opposed any plea deal that would allow Thornfield to escape full accountability. They had found their voices and were determined to ensure that every aspect of his criminal behavior was exposed and adjudicated. Their position was supported by a growing coalition of advocacy groups and reform-minded legislators, who saw the case as an opportunity to force comprehensive change. The battle over Thornfield's fate became a proxy war for the broader struggle over military culture and accountability. Traditional military leaders favored a quiet resolution that would minimize institutional damage, while reformers demanded public trials and systemic changes that would prevent future cover-ups. As the third week after the confrontation began, both sides prepared for an extended legal and political battle. The preliminary hearing for Captain Mitchell's court-martial was scheduled to begin, while prosecutors finalized charges against General Thornfield that could result in decades in prison if he was convicted. The media attention showed no signs of diminishing. International news outlets covered the story as an example of American military dysfunction, while domestic coverage focused on the broader implications for military culture and civilian oversight. The case had transcended its origins as a single incident of abuse to become a national conversation about power, accountability, and justice. Military recruitment offices reported a decline in applications, particularly from young women, as the scandal highlighted the risks faced by female service members. Defense contractors began requiring military clients to demonstrate stronger anti-harassment policies. The ripple effects of Captain Mitchell's brave decision to speak out were transforming the military establishment in ways that would have been unimaginable just weeks earlier. Legal experts debated the precedents that might be established by the case. The right of service members to publicly expose criminal behavior by their superiors had never been tested in such dramatic circumstances. The outcome could either strengthen protections for whistleblowers or establish new limits on how military personnel could challenge authority. As both sides prepared for the legal battles ahead, one thing was certain: the military would never be the same. Captain Sarah Mitchell's moment of courage had lit a fire that would burn away decades of institutional protection for predators and abusers. Whether that fire would ultimately consume the perpetrators or the truth-tellers would depend on the strength and determination of those fighting for justice. The stakes could not have been higher, and the whole world was watching to see whether America's military would choose accountability or continue protecting those who abused their authority. The courtroom at Fort Morrison had been transformed into the epicenter of one of the most significant military justice proceedings in American history. Media credentials were so sought after that a lottery system had been implemented to determine which reporters could attend. Outside, protesters held vigil, some supporting Captain Sarah Mitchell, others defending the military establishment they believed was under attack. Judge Colonel Margaret Harrison, a 30-year veteran with an impeccable reputation for fairness, presided over the preliminary hearings that would determine whether Captain Mitchell would face court-martial for striking a superior officer. The courtroom was packed with military personnel, legal experts, and advocates who understood they were witnessing a potential turning point in military justice. Rebecca Chen, Captain Mitchell's civilian attorney, had assembled a legal team that included former military prosecutors, constitutional law experts, and specialists in sexual assault cases. Their strategy was bold. They would argue that Mitchell's actions were not only justified as self-defense, but were necessary to expose criminal behavior that the military establishment had failed to address through proper channels. Your Honor, Chen began in her opening statement, Captain Mitchell stands accused of striking a superior officer, but the evidence will show that she was defending herself against an assault by a serial predator who had abused his authority for more than a decade. The real crime here is not Captain Mitchell's act of self-defense, but the system's failure to protect the women under General Thornfield's command. The military prosecutor, Colonel James Winchester, faced an almost impossible task. His job was to maintain military discipline and the chain of command, but the evidence of Thornfield's crimes made it difficult to argue that Mitchell should be punished for exposing them. Winchester's opening statement focused on the importance of military order and discipline. The military cannot function if subordinates are allowed to publicly assault their commanding officers, regardless of the circumstances, he argued. Captain Mitchell had other options available to her. She chose to take matters into her own hands, and that cannot be tolerated in a disciplined fighting force. The first witness called by the defense was Major Elena Rodriguez, Thornfield's former aide-de-camp. Her testimony provided devastating details about the systematic cover-up of his criminal behavior. Rodriguez described meetings where complaints against Thornfield were discussed and dismissed, transfers arranged to silence victims, and evidence destroyed to protect his reputation. General Thornfield operated with complete impunity, Rodriguez testified. He knew that his rank and connections would protect him from any consequences. The system designed to protect service members had become a tool for protecting predators. Under cross-examination, Colonel Winchester attempted to undermine Rodriguez's credibility by suggesting her testimony was motivated by personal animosity toward Thornfield. But Rodriguez's detailed documentation and the corroborating evidence made her account impossible to dismiss. The second week of hearings brought testimony from Thornfield's victims. One by one, brave women took the stand to describe their experiences. Lieutenant Amanda Rodriguez recounted the night Thornfield had trapped her in his office, detailing the fear and helplessness she had felt as he made his intentions clear. Sergeant Kelly Thompson described the assault during the training exercise and the retaliation she faced when she attempted to report it. Major Lisa Chen's testimony was particularly compelling, because it demonstrated the escalation in Thornfield's behavior over time. Her experience 3 years earlier showed that his crimes had become more brazen and violent as he gained confidence in his ability to escape consequences. Each woman's story followed a similar pattern: initial shock at Thornfield's behavior, failed attempts to seek help through proper channels, and the gradual realization that the system was designed to protect their attacker rather than help them. Their collective testimony painted a picture of institutional failure that extended far beyond one criminal general. The defense team's most dramatic moment came when they called Captain Mitchell herself to testify. The courtroom fell silent as she walked to the witness stand in her dress blue uniform, her bearing proud despite the circumstances. Her testimony was clear and unflinching as she described both her own assault and her decision to speak out publicly. "I knew that challenging General Thornfield would probably end my military career," Mitchell testified. "But I also knew that staying silent would mean more women would suffer. When the system fails to protect its people, individuals must be prepared to act." Chen's questioning focused on Mitchell's state of mind during the confrontation and her training in self-defense. Mitchell explained that when Thornfield struck her, her military training took over, and she responded instinctively to defend herself. "I didn't plan for him to fall and hit his head," Mitchell said. "My goal was to protect myself and expose his crimes. The fact that he was injured was an accident, but I don't regret speaking the truth about what he had done." Colonel Winchester's cross-examination attempted to show that Mitchell had planned the confrontation and intended to humiliate Thornfield publicly. But Mitchell's composed responses and consistent account undermined his efforts to portray her as a vindictive subordinate seeking revenge. Meanwhile, General Thornfield's own legal proceedings were moving forward simultaneously. His attorney, Colonel David Brooks, had been unsuccessful in negotiating a plea agreement that would satisfy both his client and the prosecutors. The evidence against Thornfield was so overwhelming that prosecutors saw little reason to offer lenient terms. The charges against Thornfield ultimately included multiple counts of sexual assault, abuse of authority, obstruction of justice, and conduct unbecoming an officer. If convicted on all counts, he faced the possibility of life in military prison and dismissal from the service in disgrace. Thornfield's case was complicated by his deteriorating mental state. The public exposure of his crimes and the collapse of his carefully constructed facade had taken a severe psychological toll. His attorney requested psychiatric evaluation, raising questions about his competency to stand trial. The psychiatric evaluation revealed a complex picture of a man whose narcissistic personality had been shattered by his dramatic downfall. Helen Morrison found that while Thornfield understood the charges against him and could assist in his defense, he remained largely in denial about the extent of his crimes. General Thornfield appears to view himself as the victim of an orchestrated attack on his reputation, Dr. Morrison reported. He minimizes his actions and continues to blame Captain Mitchell and other women for his current situation. This suggests a fundamental inability to accept responsibility for his behavior. As both cases progressed, the broader implications became increasingly clear. The military's handling of the proceedings was being scrutinized by Congress, the media, and international observers. The outcome would set precedents for how similar cases would be handled in the future, and could influence military culture for generations. Public support for Captain Mitchell continued to grow. A defense fund established by veterans organizations had raised more than $2 million, while online petitions demanding that charges against her be dropped gathered hundreds of thousands of signatures. Military personnel from around the world sent messages of support, many sharing their own stories of harassment and assault. The international dimension of the story became apparent when foreign military leaders began commenting on the case. British General Sir Michael Crawford praised Captain Mitchell's courage and noted that her actions had sparked important conversations about military culture in allied nations. The contrast with American military leadership's more cautious response was striking and embarrassing for Pentagon officials. Congressional pressure for military reform intensified as the hearings progressed. Senator Maria Rodriguez introduced legislation that would remove sexual assault cases from the military chain of command and place them under civilian prosecution. The bill, known as the Mitchell Act, gained bipartisan support as lawmakers recognized the need for fundamental change. The legislation faced resistance from military leaders who argued that removing cases from the military justice system would undermine command authority and military effectiveness. But the revelations from the Thornfield case made their arguments increasingly difficult to sustain. Defense Secretary Patricia Williams found herself caught between the demand for reform and resistance from within the military establishment. Her handling of the crisis had been criticized as too slow and reactive, leading to speculation about her future in the position. As the fourth week of hearings began, both legal teams prepared for closing arguments. The defense would argue that Captain Mitchell was a hero who had exposed criminal behavior at great personal cost, while the prosecution would maintain that military discipline required consequences for her actions regardless of their motivation. The decision would rest with Judge Colonel Harrison, whose ruling would either vindicate Captain Mitchell's courage or send a message that challenging authority, even criminal authority, would not be tolerated in the military. Outside the courtroom, the battle for public opinion continued. Social media campaigns, protest demonstrations, and media coverage kept the case in the national spotlight. The outcome was being viewed as a test of whether the military was capable of reform or would continue to protect its own at the expense of justice. The stakes extended far beyond the fate of the individuals involved. The case had become a symbol of the broader struggle for accountability and justice in American institutions. Its resolution would send a message about whether courage in the face of authority would be rewarded or punished, and whether victims of abuse would be protected or silenced. As closing arguments approached, both sides knew they were arguing not just for their clients, but for competing visions of what the military should be and how it should handle those who challenge corruption from within. The tension in the courtroom was palpable as Judge Colonel Margaret Harrison prepared to deliver her ruling on whether Captain Sarah Mitchell would face court-martial. After 6 weeks of testimony, evidence, and legal arguments, the moment of truth had arrived. The packed courtroom held its collective breath as Harrison began to speak, her words carrying the weight of precedent and the promise of justice. In the matter of the United States versus Captain Sarah Mitchell, Harrison began, her voice clear and authoritative, this court has been presented with an extraordinary set of circumstances that challenge our understanding of military justice, command authority, and the moral obligations of service members. Outside the courtroom, protesters on both sides waited anxiously for word of the decision. Media trucks lined the streets around Fort Morrison, their satellite dishes pointed skyward to carry news of the ruling to audiences around the world. In her small apartment off base, Margaret Thornfield sat alone, having finally filed for divorce from her husband, waiting to learn the fate of the woman who had exposed his crimes. Judge Harrison continued, "The evidence presented to this court has established beyond any reasonable doubt that General Marcus Thornfield engaged in a pattern of criminal sexual assault and harassment spanning more than a decade. The court has also established that institutional failures allowed these crimes to continue despite numerous warning signs and complaints." Rebecca Chen, Captain Mitchell's attorney, gripped her client's hand under the defense table. They had argued passionately for dismissal of all charges, contending that Mitchell's actions were not only justified but heroic. The prosecution had maintained that military discipline required consequences for striking a superior officer, regardless of circumstances. However, Harrison continued, this court must also consider the actions of Captain Mitchell in the context of military law and order. The question before us is not whether General Thornfield was guilty of serious crimes. That has been clearly established. The question is whether Captain Mitchell's response to those crimes was appropriate under military law. The judge paused, surveying the crowded courtroom before delivering the heart of her ruling. After careful consideration of all evidence and testimony, this court finds that Captain Mitchell acted in lawful self-defense when struck by General Thornfield. Her public exposure of his criminal behavior, while unconventional, was necessary given the institutional failures that had allowed these crimes to continue. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom as the implications became clear. Harrison raised her hand for silence before continuing. Therefore, all charges against Captain Sarah Mitchell are hereby dismissed. Furthermore, this court commends Captain Mitchell for her courage in exposing criminal behavior and protecting fellow service members at great personal cost. The courtroom erupted in cheers from Mitchell's supporters, while military prosecutors sat in stunned silence. Captain Mitchell herself remained composed, though tears of relief streamed down her cheeks. The ruling represented more than just her personal vindication. It was a watershed moment for military justice and accountability. Outside, news of the ruling spread rapidly through social media and news networks. The hashtag #JusticeForSarah trended globally within minutes as supporters celebrated the decision. Veterans organizations issued statements praising the ruling as a victory for military reform and a warning to those who would abuse their authority. But the legal saga was far from over. General Marcus Thornfield's court-martial was scheduled to begin just 2 weeks after Mitchell's vindication. Unlike the preliminary hearings for Mitchell, Thornfield's trial would be a full criminal proceeding, with the potential for decades in prison. The contrast between the two defendants could not have been more stark. While Captain Mitchell had faced her accusations with dignity and courage, Thornfield's behavior had deteriorated dramatically since his arrest. His attorney, Colonel David Brooks, struggled to manage a client whose narcissistic personality had been completely shattered by his public downfall. Thornfield's trial began with a courtroom even more packed than Mitchell's hearings. The general's appearance shocked many who had known him during his rise through the ranks. His once commanding presence had been replaced by a hollow, defeated demeanor. The man who had terrorized subordinates for years looked small and pathetic in his defendant's chair. The prosecution, led by Colonel Sarah Kim, methodically presented evidence of Thornfield's crimes. The electronic records recovered from his devices provided a chilling window into the mind of a predator who had documented his victims like hunting trophies. Text messages revealed his calculated approach to identifying vulnerable targets and his sadistic pleasure in their suffering. Victim after victim took the stand to confront their abuser directly. Lieutenant Amanda Rodriguez described how Thornfield had destroyed her confidence and nearly ended her military career. Sergeant Kelly Thompson detailed the physical and emotional trauma she had endured. Major Lisa Chen explained how the assault had changed her entire relationship with military service. Their testimony was devastating, but it was Captain Mitchell's appearance as a witness that provided the trial's most dramatic moment. She faced Thornfield across the courtroom and calmly recounted her own assault and the decision to expose his crimes publicly. General Thornfield preyed on women who believed they had no other options. Mitchell testified. He used his rank and authority as weapons against those he was supposed to protect. His greatest fear was that someone would call him out publicly, and that's exactly what needed to happen. Thornfield's defense team attempted to portray their client as a man whose career had been destroyed by vindictive subordinates and a rush to judgment. They suggested that consensual relationships had been mischaracterized as assault, and that their client was the victim of a coordinated attack on his reputation, but the evidence was overwhelming. Colonel Brooks found himself in the impossible position of defending the indefensible. His client's own documented words and actions had created an unassailable case for the prosecution. The psychiatric evaluation that had been ordered during pre-trial proceedings became a central issue during the trial. Dr. Helen Morrison testified about Thornfield's narcissistic personality disorder and his complete inability to accept responsibility for his actions. Her testimony helped explain his behavior but did not excuse his crimes. The trial revealed additional disturbing details about the cover-up that had protected Thornfield. Several senior officers were called to testify about their knowledge of complaints and their failure to act. The institutional failures that had enabled Thornfield's crimes were laid bare for all to see. Colonel James Patterson, who had led the investigation into Thornfield's crimes, testified about the systematic destruction of evidence and the intimidation of witnesses that had occurred over the years. His findings implicated multiple high-ranking officers in the cover-up, leading to additional investigations and the early retirement of several generals. After 3 weeks of testimony, the case went to the military panel that would decide Thornfield's fate. The deliberations lasted only 6 hours, an unusually short time for such a complex case, but the evidence was simply too overwhelming to require extended discussion. When the panel returned, their verdict was unanimous on all counts. General Marcus Thornfield was found guilty of multiple charges of sexual assault, abuse of authority, obstruction of justice, and conduct unbecoming an officer. The sentence was harsh but appropriate: dismissal from service, forfeiture of all pay and benefits, and 40 years in military prison. As the sentence was read, Thornfield showed no emotion. His psychological break from reality was complete. Even faced with the consequences of his crimes, he remained unable to accept responsibility for his actions. He was immediately taken into custody to begin serving his sentence. The verdicts in both cases sent shockwaves through the military establishment. Captain Mitchell's vindication and Thornfield's conviction established important precedents for future cases. Service members who exposed criminal behavior would receive protection, while those who abused their authority would face severe consequences. The broader impact extended far beyond the individuals involved. Congressional legislation inspired by the Mitchell case passed with overwhelming bipartisan support, removing sexual assault cases from the military chain of command and placing them under civilian prosecutors. The Mitchell Act represented the most significant military justice reform in decades. Defense Secretary Patricia Williams announced a comprehensive review of military culture and policies related to sexual assault and harassment. The review would be led by civilian experts and would have the authority to recommend fundamental changes to how the military operated. Military recruitment and retention were significantly affected by the case and its aftermath. Young women, inspired by Captain Mitchell's courage, began joining the military in greater numbers, confident that they would be protected from predators. Veterans organizations reported increased engagement from members who felt that the institution was finally taking accountability seriously. Captain Sarah Mitchell was promoted to major and assigned to the Pentagon, where she worked on implementing the reforms that her courage had made possible. She became a sought-after speaker on military culture and sexual assault prevention, using her platform to ensure that other victims would not suffer in silence. The ripple effects of her brave decision to speak out continued to transform the military years after that fateful morning at Fort Morrison. Training programs were overhauled, reporting procedures were streamlined, and a new generation of leaders was educated about their responsibilities to protect rather than exploit those under their command. General Thornfield remained in military prison, a forgotten relic of an era when rank provided immunity from accountability. His case became a teaching tool for military ethics courses, a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power and the importance of institutional safeguards. The story of Captain Sarah Mitchell and General Marcus Thornfield became more than just a military scandal. It became a symbol of the power of individual courage to transform entire institutions. Her decision to strike back, both literally and figuratively, against a corrupt system had created lasting change that would protect future generations of service members. As the sun set on Fort Morrison months after the initial confrontation, the base had been transformed. New leadership, new policies, and a new culture of accountability had replaced the fear and silence that had once protected predators like Thornfield. Captain Mitchell's courage had lit a fire that burned away decades of institutional rot, leaving behind a stronger, more just military. The woman who had been struck by a general in front of 400 soldiers had not only knocked out her attacker, she had knocked down an entire system of abuse and corruption. Her legacy would endure long after the headlines faded, a testament to the truth that sometimes one person's courage can change the world.